Today we're going to talk about the cell cycle. So this can be the title for your notes, or if you have a guided note packet, feel free to write this down in your note packet. So the first thing that I typically talk to people about when we talk about the cell cycle is we talk about your daily routine. And I'll tell you why in a little bit, but let me tell you about my daily routine. So typically I'm going to get up around 6 a.m. Okay, I'm going to eat breakfast, get ready for the day, drive to work, which is school. Okay, I'm gonna teach. I'm gonna have the lunch, and then I'm gonna teach some more. About 4 o'clock, I'll go home. I'll work out. Okay, maybe watch some TV, get ready for bed around 9 p.m., and then I'm going to sleep. And guess what? This repeats over and over every single day. So the next day comes around and I wake up and I do it all again. And it's a circle, it's a cycle. Well, cells do the same thing, but cells don't get up and go to work every day. They have different things that they do. And this might not last 24 hours for a cell. All right, so that's kind of what we're going to talk about is what does a cell do in its cycle? It doesn't go to work and, brush your teeth and go to bed. What does a cell do? So this is just my example. You can see kind of a visual there. So cell cycle. So the first thing I would like you to do is write down cell cycle, and then I want you to draw a picture of this. This is all we're putting in this picture, so it doesn't need to be very big, but basically I'm going to have you draw a circle. And then you're going to pretend like you took one little slice of pie out of that circle. And then you can draw some arrows around the outside, and I want you to make sure that you label it. Labels are important. So what happens here is a cell is an interphase. It's not dividing for most of its time, most of its life. So interphase, most of the time, it's not dividing. About 10% of the time, it is dividing. So the majority of the time, the cell's getting ready to divide or it's doing its job. And then about 10% of the time, it's dividing. This repeats over and over. And this is why we call it a cell cycle. Go ahead and write this down. So this is a cycle of mitosis and interphase, and the cell repeats it over and over. You'll see on the left here, this is a different diagram, but it's showing just a more detailed look here. So interphase, there's actually different parts to interphase. There's a part called G1. You don't need to know the name, okay? This is when they're going to copy the organelles. The S phase, when DNA gets copied. Another G phase, G stands for growth. So basically it's growing, copying, organelles copying DNA, getting ready to divide. You'll see off to the side here is G0. This just means a cell is going and doing its job. It doesn't need to divide anymore. Some cells, like nerve cells, or specifically like brain cells, they go into this G0 phase because they don't ever divide. And that's why if you get damage to your brain, you can't really repair that damage because those brain cells don't divide. They can't make more brain cells. So this is where cells go when they're doing their job. And then we have mitosis, which has all the phases there, PMAT and then cytokinesis. Here's another image, okay? It's a similar one. Again, these are interphase. They just have different labels. And then mitosis. Again, you're not responsible for what happens at each of the different parts of interphase here. I just need you to know that mitosis only happens for a short amount of time, and that typically interphase is when they're getting ready to divide. You'll see there's these red marks here. So this diagram has what we call checkpoints. Just like if you were going through, let's say you wanted to cross the border into Canada, they would have a checkpoint and they would check your passport. Kind of similar to that. After this G1, there's a checkpoint, a protein that checks to make sure, hey, the cell's big enough that it can divide, it's got a lot of nutrients, it's doesn't have any DNA damage. If it does, then that's a problem. And the cell's going to say, hey, you can't go on and copy and then divide. Okay, you can't go on and divide because we got some problems that we have to fix. Over here at this checkpoint, it's going to check, okay, is the cell big enough? Is it big enough to divide? Is the DNA copied correctly? If it is, it can go on. It can pass go. If not, it's got to stay here. And then the M, they're going to check that the chromosomes are attached to the little spindle fibers that are moving them. They're attached correctly. So what we're going to write down is that there are checkpoints along the cell cycle to make sure that the cell is prepared to divide. Again, I don't necessarily need you to memorize these checkpoints, their names, but just know that these checkpoints help make sure that our cell is copied correctly and then it divides correctly. So here's the problem with cancer. Normally, a cell splits in two, and eventually, if there's a damaged cell, it's going to die. With cancer, what happens is when there's a damaged cell, it doesn't trigger the cell to die. It doesn't trigger it to basically explode and die. What happens is that with cancer cells, they turn off that mechanism and basically they're allowed to copy forever and ever. So a damaged cell divides and divides and makes lots and lots of copies, and that's why we actually have tumors. A tumor is just a whole bunch of cells, and the reason there's so many cells is because they just keep copying. So with cancer, the important part is that the checkpoints don't work. So even though the cell is damaged, the cell goes past those checkpoints and keeps dividing.